Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
And welcome back to the show. We are very have our friend Ashley Pinkeney joining us here. Welcome back. How are you today?
I'm doing well this morning.
Okay, please start off telling us a little bit about yourself and what it is you do specifically.
Yes, I'm a marriage and family therapist and the owner of Hummingbird Marriage and Family Therapy, which is a private practice in Rochester, New York. And I specialize with supporting people through the ebbs and flows of life so they're able to overcome longstanding issues they see as burdens, create healthy, authentic relationships, and build a value-oriented life.
Thank you so much. Let me ask you this, for those new time listeners or even new time viewers, just remind us how we can reach out to you. Tell us your website, phone number, any form of contact.
Yes. So website is hummingbirdmft.com. So that's hummingbird, M as in marriage, F as in family, T as in therapy.com. Phone number is 585-443-3124. And you also can reach me on my social media accounts, which Instagram and Facebook, and that is Hummingbird MFT.
All right. Thanks so much. Now, I know today we want to talk about grief. Maybe not an easy topic, loss, but it happens to all of us, fortunately or unfortunately in life. And it's really a big part of life. And I know you help people live again, in a sense, after going through this. So do you mind telling us a little bit why you think it's important to start off today's show by talking about grief?
Yes. So grief is it's a normal life process and a transition all of us will experience at some point in life. So if you don't know what the definition of grief is, it's the process of experiencing the psychological, social, and physical reactions of loss. And that does not include death. Like most people associate grief with death and that type of loss, but we have so many different types of non-death losses that can occur as well that impact our mental health. So things such as the loss of a relationship, changing jobs, movings, a divorce, even like the diagnosis of a terminal or a chronic illness. So essentially something that we lose something important to us could just impact our mental health and how we, deal with the world around us.
Now, also, I was reading about grief also sometimes being confused with depression.
Yes. So grief and depression are different things. They overlap in some of the symptoms, but where they differ is that grief tends to be trigger related. So in other words, like a person can feel relatively okay, but when certain situations, such as like if friends or family are, bring up a certain topic or, they notice something that is related to what their loss is, they might feel that sadness that can happen. So depression, on the other hand, tends to be a lot more pervasive and people rarely can get the same type of relief from those symptoms as much. And usually with depression, that requires a diagnosis, possibly medication and different types of treatment. But grief is something that will just take a little bit less time to be able to get through. We just learn how to integrate into our lives a little bit more the losses that we have.
Got it. All right. So, Ashley, would you mind sharing a little bit about, as a thanatologist, what that is? And I know you're passionate about working with those suffering with loss and grief. So, explain to us a little bit about your background and what brought you.
So, thanatologist, that's me. So that is just an expert in grief, loss, and bereavement. It's something I worked on for several years of just being interested in that, and it brought me to that space actually starting when I was a teenager. So I worked in a retirement community as a teen, and specifically I noticed that, we had a lot of people who were aging population. They would experience a lot of losses. And I remember specifically there was a couple who I had worked with, and they had been married for something like 70 years. Like they were well into their 90s. They had been married for so long. And I remember when one of the partners had passed away and just the changes that happened in her husband after he died. I mean, it was just devastating to me. And I just remember specifically thinking to myself, and I had to be probably about 20 or so at the time. And I was like, I wish I knew like how to help them. Like, I wish I knew what to do. And then I just started thinking like, well, maybe I should be a counselor. Like maybe there's something I could do with that. And then found out about this thing called marriage and family therapy. And then the school I actually went to had an internship at a hospice. And I was like, that seems like all this stuff is lining up together. So because of that and experiencing those kind of losses and just being surrounded by other types of people who were grieving and loss related is just was on my path. And it's something I just really enjoy working with. And it's very nice often to work with people and you're learning about the people who they lost from their perspective, which is oftentimes from such a place of love.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing that. And I just want to remind everyone to reach out to you. Please share the website.
Yes, it's hummingbirdmft.com.
Perfect. Thanks so much. All right. So let's talk more now about if you don't mind, maybe some of your experiences working with those with grief and, of course, bereavement. Would you mind sharing some of that?
Yes. So I worked at a hospice for the better part of a year when I was in school. And, I can't give a lot of information because of privacy, but, I think I learned a lot of things that are just instrumental about who I became as a therapist. And, a lot of that is being able to listen to people, to be able to understand these life experiences. But then from there, going into a lot of other experiences that I've worked with. Like one of the first clients I ever had was a woman who experienced like an infant loss. And I remember that was just like such a devastating thing that happened, but it also helped me want to like advocate more for like adequate care related to maternal health for women. And all these things are connected to each other. And then I also ended up running groups for several years for like women who experienced infant and child loss when I worked at a children's hospital. So all of it interconnected. And then so many other like support groups that I've done just related to like traumatic losses, spousal loss, children loss. And then also just I ran a weekend retreat for bereaved mothers, like based off of that support group that I did. And then I also wrote a book chapter based off of their experiences in the book called Perinatal Palliative Care, which is a clinical guide for clinicians such as doctors, nurses, other social workers, therapists, et cetera. And the chapter is on perinatal bereavement to be able to support parents and families who've had infant child loss, miscarriage, like those sort of things.
Oh. Also, retreats and all I know you've done, right? What type of retreats can people be aware of that's out there for them?
So I've done retreats that are specifically related to infant and child loss for mothers and beautiful things of being able to give them support and find other women who have gone through that and just find community in that space. And then also being able to have self-care in those places. I'm currently running a group with another therapist at the Breast Cancer Coalition here in Rochester for women of color who are newly diagnosed with breast cancer and gynecological cancers. And we've been doing that for the better part of a year. And then I work with a small organization in Rochester called Dreams from Drake. And they are a nonprofit that provides bereavement support for children and their families when they've experienced a loss. So we do support groups for children and their parents or caregivers, and paired with like fun activities so that we can, help them learn about grieving, but also still let them be connected to their childhood and having fun and those sort of things. And we do a camp every year called Camp Dreams, where it's a 3-day bereavement camp for the children that has a mixture of camp stuff and, grief and bereavement related activity.
Dreams from Drake?
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right, good. I read about that earlier. Okay.
Yeah, so we do a camp every single year. We actually just had it back in early July. Wonderful 3 days that we were able to have with the kids.
And you technically are also an author, right? Tell us about what you wrote.
I know. I just so many things. I always like, the book part too. So yeah, there's the book, Perinatal Palliative Care, which is a clinical guide for therapists, doctors, nurses. That was published in 2020. And I have a chapter that's on perinatal bereavement care. So, from the experiences of the parents who I had worked with over time, I used a lot of those experiences to talk about how other clinicians can give quality care to grieving families and grieving parents. And I think that's important because a lot of times people can see people's experiences and forget that, oh, this is like an actual person. It's not just like a case or a number and that sort of thing. I really wanted to bring humanity back into that space of being able to care for people and make sure that it's person-centered and not just clinically centered.
Oh. Now, do you want to talk more specifically about, there's also was it Sisters of Color group? What is that specifically? And then that's also, you mentioned breast cancer, but the Breast Cancer Coalition specifically too.
Yes. So the Breast Cancer Coalition in Rochester is one of the organizations that works with women who and men who've had like newly diagnosed breast cancer and gynecological cancers. So this group is something that we started early this year in February because there was a high need for women of color to have a support group. And, there's a lot of groups that are out here, but, a lot of women, particularly women of color, do not have the access to those groups, or they just don't have the information about how the numbers look when it comes to breast cancers, of like how much diagnosis happens and the importance of early intervention. So we created a group to be able to have more community there. So the women are able to talk with each other, connect with each other about their experiences, and just share different resources as well. And also just have like a therapeutic space as well to be able to talk about these things. So myself and another facilitator named Fatima, we run this group, and we've been doing this for the better part of a year. And it's really wonderful to see the women connect with each other and just find community. Because I think that in loss, particularly when it's health related losses and there's so many uncertain things, having other people who look like you can talk to about different things is so important, and finding that space.
Do you want to share a little bit more about grief in particular and go through some of the stages or the types of grief in particular?
Yes. So, one of the main types of grief is just uncomplicated, an uncomplicated grief. Excuse me. So, that is where, you have different thought patterns such as disbelief, there's confusion, preoccupation, even just sensing your loved one. Like I remember when my grandmother passed away, that I just kind of, when I was at her house, I still just kind of sensed that she was around, that her space was, that she was still there, and still just kind of confused about the whole thing of it. But then there's also like the physical sensations that we have. Like grief is exhausting on our bodies. It's very tiring. You can find yourself sleeping more. You can find yourself very just tired, hungry. There's a lot of physical sensation, like your body's trying to adjust to things. Behavioral characteristics, there's the sadness, there's anger, disbelief. There's also tearfulness that can come up as well. And then the emotional experience of it can be such a wide range for so many people that, you have so many different feelings. And I think a lot of them are very normal that people can have. And, being able to have community around you to help you through grief experiences is important. And all of those things are not just related to death, like I said earlier, but to other losses. So if we move, if we have a different job, if we have a breakup, I'm pretty sure like all of those experiences that I'm talking about can relate to any of those too.
Got it. Well, thanks for sharing that. And then also, we just want to remind everyone how we can reach you. We are not taking a commercial break today. We are doing live here on the Zoomcast and podcast for those of you that are watching or those just listening. I get to see your face to face today, which is awesome. Ashley, by the way, you've been doing this for how many years now? And just tell us a little about your credentials, and then tell us, how we can reach you, and we'll continue the conversation.
So I have been a therapist for going on 12 years. It has flown on by. And I am a marriage and family therapist. I am a thanatologist as well, owner of Hummingbird Marriage and Family Therapy here in Rochester. You can reach me at 585-443-3124. And the business website is Hummingbird, M as in marriage, F as in family, T as in therapy.com. Also, social medias are at Hummingbird MFT.
Perfect. All right. So now there's something called anticipatory grief.
Yes.
Do you share what that is? Thank you.
Sure. So anticipatory grief is like a reaction to a loss that you were able to anticipate, such as if an individual dies from a long-term illness, or if we're not feeling well, and then you get like a diagnosis that there might have been a health concern. So it's something that you can have occur, and like you kind of knew it was coming. And as soon as you accept it and understand it, you begin grieving. So connecting back to that conversation we had a couple of weeks ago, talking about anticipated life transitions, anticipatory grief connects with that, because it's being able to know and maybe anticipate that you're likely going to have a loss, and gives you a chance to prepare for it in some way. And oftentimes when people have those experiences where they're able to prepare, their grief experiences later are not as intense because they knew it was coming. So it gives us a chance to plan, get supports in place, ensure a smooth transition, but it doesn't take away that stress that it can happen. It just makes it a little bit more manageable.
Got it. All right. Makes sense. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
And also want to point out there's something called secondary loss.
Yes. So secondary losses are the things that may be like the multiple other losses stemming from a primary loss. So if we're talking about, somebody moving from one side of the country to another side, I've done that before. I can tell you there's a lot of secondary losses with that. So, there is, maybe the loss of your like primary support system around you all the time in that experience. There was just a loss of finances in general. Like it took a lot to move across the state, across the country. There also were just losses related to even just what I remember myself of just being like, okay, what am I doing? Do I know what I'm doing? Do I got this? Like, I'm in a completely new environment. What do I do here? Like, how do I figure out this stuff? And just, all of the comforts that were there before. So for that kind of loss, there's that. But then also, if we're talking about death related losses, then there's grief that is, related to somebody who died, but then also, are there other things that maybe that they did or that they were connected to in your life that are no longer there? So like, I can remember like when my grandmother passed away, she always would make desserts at the family holiday meals. So we're kind of like, well, who's going to make the desserts now? Like, that's not something that you would think of like, oh, like here's another loss of she's not going to be here to do these sort of things, or, things like that, where if you lost a spouse and they used to, cut the grass or something, you're like, oh, so do I cut the grass now? Do I hire somebody to do it? Like what, these little things along the way that sometimes just pop up and we don't realize it until it's there in the moment of like, okay, this is coming from that initial loss that we had.
All right. Makes sense. I think my mic's cutting out a little bit here. I'm sorry. I keep moving closer to my face, but do you hear me?
Yes, I got you.
So mass grief, collective grief, disenfranchised grief. There's still plenty of more forms. Please elaborate on those too. Thank you.
Yes. So masked grief, it's the grief reactions that impair normal functioning. However, the individual can be unable to recognize these symptoms and behaviors. So masked grief is oftentimes in physical symptoms or other maladaptive behaviors that we might have, such as like acting out. So like I was saying earlier, I work with Dreams from Drake, which is a bereavement support group that works with children and their families. So oftentimes when I'm talking to the parents, they're telling me about, how is their child grieving? And they'll be like, well, they're acting out, or they're having a lot of physical symptoms, like their stomach is bothering, they're getting headaches, like they're not able to go to school because they're not feeling well. And, that is some masked grief oftentimes because these symptoms are coming up, and sometimes, particularly in some children, they may not have the emotional vocabulary that is able to talk about what they're going through. So, that's something important to know of, if you're noticing a child that's had a loss and they're having all these things going on, it may be grief related, and being able to talk with them about that or connecting them with somebody else who can help them explain that is really helpful. Or even the kids who act out and are, cutting up in school and stuff like that, or something like that, that might be a masked grief reaction to hide their pain or express it in a way that feels normal to them.
Interesting. Learning about this too, and not just our listeners. I didn't realize there's that many different forms of it. What other form did you want to discuss next?
So there's collective grief. So collective grief is felt by a collective group of people, such a community, society, in the event of such as a war, a national disaster, terrorist attack, death of a public figure, massive, collective global pandemic like we had a couple of years ago. So, collective grief is just something that we feel as a community, and it impacts all of us so much, and it can impact the way that our society is, or how we do things, or how we see things. It's just, those constant losses that can be happening in those experiences really take a toll on people and how they're living and how they interact in the world. It can also cause a huge shift in how we do things after that type of loss. So, with a lot of things related to COVID-19, there's a lot of things that have changed related how we live life that probably will not go back to anything before 2020. And I think that's important to know, like how those big things impact us, but also that we're not alone in those experiences.
Yeah. All right. Good to know. Right. And the disenfranchised grief, right?
Yes.
That's with more. Could you share that one, because that deals with a lot: suicide, death, right?
Yes.
Diseases.
Yes, so disenfranchised grief, and I actually used to run a support group on this because it's one of these ones where there's like stigma attached to the loss. So it can make somebody's grief and their loss feel invalidated if this occurs. So, if we're talking from a death related point, like, there might be stigma surrounding like a suicide. If somebody has an overdose, if there was like drunk driving, even in relationships, like I've worked with some people where, their spouse, or sorry, their ex-spouse or an ex-partner has died. And, they feel like, can I grieve this because we're not together anymore? Or having a miscarriage, or like the death of a pet. And, even relationships such as in same-sex couples, that's also could be grief if there's losses related to that too. And then the losses that are not related to death, such as like dementia or a traumatic brain injury. I remember my grandfather had Alzheimer's, and seeing the loss of him and the person who I knew over time was such a big change to me. And that definitely was a grief and a loss that happened. And then, some people also lose people related to like substance use, where, the person who they know is no longer that because of the use of drugs. So there's so much just stigma that's related to that, or there's just these losses that they feel like, okay, can I acknowledge this, or can I talk about this without feeling like shamed or guilted about this, or just invalidated with my experiences?
All right.
Mm.
Also, want to point out, if you're just tuning in, you work obviously virtually, right? I know you're in
Yes.
Rochester, New York, but you can help someone again with counseling, marriage, family, anywhere around the world. It's a virtual,
Mm.
which is
Yes.
good. You don't have to be present. So anyone listening, no matter where you are, could take advantage of Ashley's services. And again,
Mm-hmm.
today our topic here is grief, but there's so much more to what she does.
Mm-hmm.
Also, life after, what do we say? Life after loss. So
Yes.
how can therapy help us when we're dealing with any type of grief?
Right. So therapy can be really helpful because you're having community, you're having somebody to talk to, number one. But, in therapy, particularly when I work with people, I try to help them accomplish like the 4 tasks of mourning. So that's related to Warden's task of mourning. So it's trying to accomplish the mourning process and to have some equilibrium reestablished within your life. So in no particular order, the tasks look at, accepting the reality of the loss, working through the pain of the grief, adjusting to the environment which the deceased is missing, the external, internal, and spiritual losses, and then finding an enduring connection to the person who you lost while embarking and investing in your life. So being able to know that there's all of those different tasks are there, but they can come up in different times. Like there may be other times where, you felt like you accepted the reality of loss, and then a holiday comes up or a birthday, and it's like, oh, I feel like I'm back at this task where I have to work this out again. Or like I was saying earlier, of like things that people used to do. So like adjusting to the environment of figuring those things out over time, like as they come up. So that's one way to work through grief. And then also I like to look at the dual process model of grief, which describes like loss orientation and restoration orientation. So loss orientation is focusing on and processing through the loss that the person has at that time, like related to somebody who died, as well as a relationship with the person. And then restoration orientation is the secondary stresses, kind of like the secondary losses we were talking about earlier. So there's feelings of isolation, there's grief bursts that happen, and even just being able to like adjust to everyday normal things that are going on. So going back to work or still having to parent your children. So it's like you're shifting like a pendulum between both of those spaces of, I still have to go to work, but I'm grieving and I'm sad, but I got to pull myself out of bed and do these things. And I still, I'm feeling sad. I'm still feeling upset. Like, or here's a grief experience that happened and I still got to go to the grocery store. Like, it's shifting between both of those dynamics all at time, and being able to find some balance for yourself so you can invest in your life and still do the things that you need to do on a regular basis.
Got it. Well, we have 2 minutes left in the show. What else did you want to add, Ashley?
Well, I just want to say that, healthy grieving is just, it's a dynamic of like engaging, the both of those sides of being able to confront your loss and avoid the loss, and then being able to cope with like the grief at the times when we need to and seek respite for it. So, there's a whole lot with that. And I'm going to post some resources on my Instagram later this week related to grief and loss for people who are more interested in that space. And last thing, grief is a normal thing. Like, we all experience it. One of my mentors said to me, all therapy is grief therapy, because we're all grieving something, whether it's a person, a dream, an experience, whatever it may be. It's something we go through. And as we orient ourselves about that, the better we're going to be at the end of the day.
Thank you so much. Please remind us again one more time how we can reach you.
So that is hummingbirdmft.com. The phone number is 585-443-3124. And I'm located in Rochester, New York, offering individual and couples therapy in all these settings. Yes.
Beautiful. Anywhere around the world. Thank you
Anywhere.
so much. All right, Ashley, have a fantastic day. Pleasure having you here and looking forward to seeing you again. Beautiful office, by the way. Or maybe
Thank
that's your
you.
living room, but it's beautiful.
No, it's my office. Thank you.
Bye-bye, sweetheart. Thank you.
Are you looking for even more of the podcasts and hosts that you love? The Podcast Business News Network is proud to announce that you now have even more ways to listen live. Check out the MyTuner Radio, online radio box, and Simple Radio apps on iOS and Android, or find us online. Search for Business News Network on mytuner-radio.com, or search Podcast Business News Network on streama.com and onlineradiobox.com/US. Take your podcast on the go and don't miss a minute of the action.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
For nearly 2,000 severely injured veterans, everyday life has become filled with barriers.
Day-to-day simple tasks can become pretty daunting.
I have to carry my chair up 2 flights of steps or have somebody do it for me.
What scares me the most is just the falling.
When I'm struggling with my house, I think, to have that one great barrier just knocked down, it's crucial.
Home for Our Troops is a wonderful nonprofit that builds a
mortgage-free, fully adaptive, handicap-accessible house.
And there's no catch.
It'll be our very first home that we've ever owned. This is a game changer.
This is where your life begins again.
We need you to join us in completing this important mission. Please visit hfotusa.org and help build homes and rebuild lives.
Because of you, everything's going to be okay.